Welcome back, everyone. We are so excited to be in Oregon today. We're in Medford, and we're speaking with the Reverend who works with folks who are homeless in a variety of different areas, and we wanted to do a highlight of this during our time in the focus on the economy. One of the things that we talked about before we got started was how close so many people are to homelessness, and we generally like to assume that won't happen to us, and oftentimes that's the case. But when it does happen, what is it that we can do as citizens, and how is it that we bring that together? Kind of from a personal perspective, many folks know that I had a daughter at 23 weeks. Her medical bills on day one exceeded $1 million. By the time we left, they exceeded $4 million. We were lucky that she was born at a time where the $1 million cap had been removed. But had she been born 6 months earlier, we would have lost everything. And when people end up in those shoes where they have to choose between their child and their home, I'm thrilled to hear they choose their child, but I'm sad when it is that we point fingers, we think about people not planning ahead, we assume that people haven't done their homework in a way they should, and oftentimes that's not the case. So we want to bring a kind of a human element to this and talk a little bit more about what the options are, and certainly what is it that we need to do next, because we're not there and we're seeing more people be homeless.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us a little bit about your background,
Okay.
How you got here by way of Alaska and a variety of other spaces, so people can understand kind of your eyes and what your lens is.
Mm-hmm. My name is Reverend Richmond, and I moved here about 6.5 years ago from Fairbanks, Alaska, where I spent 18 years. I was, when I was in Alaska, I was a pastor for 10 years, a hospital chaplain in a behavioral health ward for 3 years. And then I worked for the Alaska state legislature. I was an aide to Senator Joe Thomas for 3 years. And then got back into ministry, and I've been down here. When I came down here, I knew it was a downtown church, but and I knew we would have some of the problems of a downtown church. What I didn't expect was a congregation that took that very seriously and wanted to minister to the community around us. And so we do a food bank every week. When I came here in 2013, we were running an average of 20 families a week. On a big week, it would be 30 families. We're now running on a small week for us is 60, and we've run almost 100 families.
Now, is that because you're servicing more, or is that because the problem is
the problem
increased?
The problem has grown.
Wow.
Food insecurity is a major problem. Nowhere in the country can people live on minimum wage. And when we see all these statistics about the economy doing better, that doesn't necessarily mean the mass of people are doing better. And there's a lot of people who are barely eking it out on minimum wage. And everything has to be into place. If one thing falls out of place, if they have a car repair that they can't afford, then they can't get to work, they lose their job.
Yep.
They lose their job, they lose their house. Or medical bills that they weren't expecting. And it just throws everything out of whack. So probably at the food bank, 2/3 of the people that we see there have jobs or has someone in their family working full time. But in order to, it comes down to rent or groceries. And they don't want to lose their home, because once you lose your home in Medford, it's really hard to get back into housing. It's incredibly hard. We have a 1% vacancy rate, and so in order to get in, you have to have a credit check, and you have to have first month's rent and last month's deposit, or deposit and or a last month's rent. And to save all that up when you're on minimum wage is very, very hard. If you've been evicted because you couldn't pay your bills before, then they don't have to take you. And so we had the police have been very helpful in trying to get people back into housing. And we had a woman come in, and she had She wanted $40 because that would get her a housing voucher, which would get her into an open slot into a house. And so we gleefully wrote her a check for $40, or wrote the company a check for $40. And the next day, the policeman who was working with her called us and said, well, we found out some more, and it's no longer just $40. It's $2,500 that she needed to get in. And so now they're trying to, on Monday this woman was ecstatic because she was moving into a home, and then on Wednesday she finds out, she needs an extra $2,500 to do it. We managed to come up with the money and get her into a home. Between the police and we kicked in some. We didn't kick in the whole amount, but we helped some with that. And but that's what people are up against.
Wow, I mean that's a lot of stacks.
Yeah.
And from my perspective, because I take a human perspective, I try to put myself in someone's shoes. I'm exhausted.
Oh yeah.
Right? In this moment, I'm trying so hard to just survive that even the story, I'm exhausted.
The people who live in what I call a culture of poverty, and other people call a culture of poverty, it's hard to understand what that's like.
Yeah.
When everything is really hard. Everything is hard. And if one thing falls out of place, it all falls apart. So that kind of anxiety, that kind of pressure. And somebody was complaining that, that they knew they were working with someone who was in that culture of poverty, and they got like an extra $100 for something, and they went and got a tattoo. And they were just furious that they wasted the money that way. And we had to sit down and say, look, they're never going to pay off all their bills.
No.
Ever.
No.
It's not going to happen. They're never going to have another $100, and they've wanted this tattoo, and life is so hard, I can finally do something for myself.
Yep.
They should get more education. A lot of people grow up in families where it's never assumed they could go to college.
Right.
It's that you might as well tell them they're going to go to the moon. That's so far off, and so they aren't able to better themselves. A large portion of the people we work with are the working poor, and they also work with a lot of homeless folks. We give out bag lunches every day, and when we started, we were doing 1 or 2 a month, and people started to hear about that, and that came to 1 or 2 a week, and then people heard about that. I think last week we gave out 400 lunches in 4 days.
Wow. Again, same question. Is it because the population has grown that needs it, or have you grown?
The population
in your
that needs it has grown. I mean, we just meet the need. We managed to come up with that. I don't know how we do it sometimes, and we've had to start. We on Sunday morning after one of our worship services, they do an assembly line and fill all the bags.
Oh, nice.
And now we're having to come in midweek and check to see how many we need and if we need to fill more bags. So it's the need is out there.
So what's the difference in demographic between those that are homeless and those that are the working poor?
Other than
the obvious.
The homeless often have problems. Well, two of the big reasons for being homeless is drug addiction, alcoholism, or mental health, and often in the same person. And so, we were talking the other day about it. It's a chicken or an egg thing. Frankly, if I had to sleep out on the streets every night, I don't know if I would want to go to bed sober.
Well, I mean, this is it, right? We talk about, to your point of the tattoo, and the same thing. If life is miserable and you have an opportunity to do something fun, how many of us don't say to ourselves, you know what? I know I shouldn't. I mean, it happened to me last night. Everything in my RV went wrong.
Uh-huh.
My heat, my generator, and my power cord all went out within 24 hours. Mm-hmm. And you bet. I had a glass of wine, some popcorn, and of course these aren't on my diet, and I shouldn't have been eating them. But it was a terrible day.
Right.
And yet,
and the
I had a roof over my head.
The terrible day for you was a blip.
What was a blip? That's right, it was. And yet, I went to the coping mechanisms, of course, that everyone recommended online, would we have allowed those same affordances to somebody who every single day is facing this? Every single day is exhausted. Every single day is trying to get out of their head. A lot of people don't realize when you have mental health problems that a lot of people feel it and they know it, and they can feel themselves coming in and out of lucidity.
We
It's
see people
scary.
that they have good days,
Yeah.
and then they have bad days. We had a woman who just as sweet could be, but early on this week she was standing in the street corner yelling about conspiracy theories and blasphemy, and the cops were killing children and all sorts of things. And I went down and sat with her just to try to calm her down one day and spend some time with her. And then she was in our food bank yesterday, and she apologized for being, a problem, and she understood that. She could remember that, but at that time she could not control what was going on in her head.
Can't keep a job like that.
She went back to no, you can't. We have a guy out there who's got one leg. He's been in a car accident. He's got 3 metal plates in his brain, and he has severe brain trauma.
Oh my
and
gosh.
We've done a lot of trying to get him help in different places, and I've watched him. We were trying to get him into rehab, and as he was waiting, going from angry that he has to wait to very penitent and I'm sorry I yelled at you, back to angry again. And he had the emotional lability of a 3-year-old. But that's what he's got. That's the
that's reality.
That he's been dealt.
Yeah.
And he can't do groups because he has no filter.
Right.
And he was in a group once, and somebody was talking about they wanted to kill themselves, and he just said, "I think you ought to do it. You're boring me."
Having run a number of groups, I was going right there. I knew that's what was going to be said.
It doesn't work well in a group setting. It's not a therapeutic intervention.
Well, ironically, sometimes people come back with, "What?" And then they go, "Wait, I'm not like him." And they actually pull themselves out sometimes, and other times they're so low they can't.
I hope that's what happened to this person.
I hope so.
Yeah.
They realize, okay, that man literally isn't dealing with a full deck, and that's hard. So you bring up a good point. One of the things that there's a hot topic in our nation right now, unrelated to economy and homelessness, but nonetheless, in this case, I think related. We talk a lot about gun violence. We talk about one solution is to reduce access to guns. Another question, though, that keeps coming up is some people recognize that these individuals are having struggles, mental health issues, or have had abusive home issues, homelessness issues, a variety of things. And they've said, but we didn't know where to send them. In some cases, it's their own child, and sometimes it's their neighbor, sometimes it's someone that they know through work. What are the solutions that we have available?
There was a woman, I heard her wailing outside my window, and I went outside, and she had covered herself in her own feces. I assume they were, I don't know where she got them, but was covered in feces and wailing at the top of her voice. She was a schizophrenic woman who's lived around the park. And so we're cleaning her up, and somebody says, go to the Crisis Intervention Center. So we go to the crisis intervention. We send somebody over there, and the guy comes over, and he looks at this woman on the floor, and we're still wiping crap off of her, literally.
Yeah.
And the first question out of his mouth was, "What kind of insurance do you have?"
I assume that was a check in the box question. Clearly, he knew the answer.
And she looked up at him and told him to F off. And it's the most coherent thing she'd said all day. I thought, I just couldn't believe it. And we have a medical system, a mental health system.
Yes.
Well, the mental health system we've designed in this country assumes that the people who use it are not mentally ill.
Yes.
In order to take advantage of this system, you have to be pretty smart, you have to be a good planner, and you really have to have your stuff together.
Yeah.
And that's the system we've designed. In order to get through it, you've got to do all that. And you're talking about people that from day to day sometimes don't know who they are. And we've got a guy on the street, he's homeless, he's pre-Alzheimer's. He can't remember appointments.
No.
He doesn't know what day it is. Plus, anybody that's out on the street, a lot of them don't have watches. If they have watches, they've been stolen. They don't know what day it is. They tell time through the chimes in our church. And when they're broken, there are a lot of missed appointments in this town.
Really?
Yeah.
That's a brilliant way to do it, though. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. We schedule our food bank around the chimes so that people will know when to come.
Well, ironically, I was walking in today to the chime.
Yeah.
And I walked up to the door,
The 9
and the
o'clock
gentleman
chimes?
said, "Here's your bag." And I said, "Sir, I'm here to see the Reverend."
We give a bag lunch to whoever comes
well, I was
to
going
our
to say,
door.
and then I thought, do I need to change?
No, we have a guy that came every day for I don't know how long, and he wore a suit. And some of the people, our policy is you come to the door, you ask for a bag lunch, you get the bag lunch.
Okay.
Well, this guy had a suit, and people were beginning to grumble a little bit. Well, and then he disappeared, and he came in about a week after he disappeared, and he says, "I just want you to know, I lost my job, and every day I set a goal of getting 3 or 4 interviews. And so I wore my suit every day because I wanted to have an interview. And your lunches were all I had during those 3 weeks I was looking for a job. But I got a job, and you came in to thank us." So, just
That's a great
because
story.
somebody, we think of the poor person as not having anything, but often they don't have what they need. So you might have a car because you lost your house and you need to sleep in your car. So yeah, you might drive up and get a bag lunch, but you have nowhere to live, and you don't maybe you got laid off for whatever reason, you lost your job, and you managed to have the wherewithal to keep your car. We always try to help people who are living in their cars because they have the wherewithal to know to keep what they've got.
Yeah.
And so usually people who are living in their cars don't have a major mental illness or a major drug and alcohol problem. They've just had the fuzzy end of the lollipop of life, and they're trying to deal with that as much as they can.
So you're dealing very much at the tactical level
Yeah.
and helping people in these key areas.
We also
to
have
bridge.
a permanent supportive housing program.
Mm-hmm.
One of the women who had been around was, the first time I met her, I had to take her to the ER, and her veins were so collapsed they couldn't draw blood from her. Intravenous drug user.
Yeah.
But she kept taking her around. She kept coming around. She comes in Christmas Eve, and my wife saw her and realized that somebody was going to have to sit beside her, and it better be her because my wife is wonderful at dealing with anybody. And they got to know one another, and Sandra kept coming around and kept coming around. And finally one day she came in bleeding from a bike accident. My wife took her to the hospital and stayed there until they got her into behavioral health ward. And had my wife not stayed there, she wouldn't have gotten in.
Yeah.
And we learned something, that you take someone and drop them off, they're treated like just the next patient. You take someone and advocate for them, you can get them through the system. And Sandra went through rehab. She went through outpatient rehab. She went through inpatient rehab. And when she got out, we realized she had nowhere to go. She was going to be back on the streets.
Mm-hmm.
So we got her into some temporary supportive housing, and then one of our parishioners put her up, and we decided we needed to start a home for people like this that had gone through rehab but were homeless. And so now we have 3 women who live in that home, and we've talked to their counselors. All of them have made tremendous progress. Sandra went from heavy drug and alcohol user. She's been clean for 1.5 years now.
Wow.
Clean and sober, no minor relapses. I mean, she's just done great. And
Is she able to get a job?
No. And we're working on getting disability for her.
Okay.
She lived on the street for 20 years, and she was a heavy drug user. She's got PTSD. She takes a slew of psychotropic drugs to deal with, I'm not sure what all her problems are.
Right.
And we've tried, my wife was the buyer for the local shelter for food, and she tried to get Sandra involved in that to help out, and she just realized that it wasn't going to happen.
Yeah.
That Sandra wasn't able to do that. So, but she's got a place to stay.
Yeah.
And the other women in there, one of them was sexually abused from the age of 3. And her issues weren't necessarily drug and alcohol use,
Right.
although she did go through rehab but her major diagnosis was the trauma from that, and she was homeless. And now, because she's got a place where she knows she can put her head every night, we're hearing from her counselors that she's just making great improvement.
Love it.
So, you give people a place to stay. It doesn't have to be great. Although the house we did, we tried to make it a nice house. But just a stable place where they know that it's not in a bush and the cops aren't going to come roust them out in the middle of the night. All of a sudden, they've got more resources to deal with their other problems. So I think it starts with housing. And the more people you can house, the better we will be able to deal with some of their other problems. But we've got some friends of mine that are on the street, and I managed one day talking to go to rehab, but they had to do outpatient for 2 weeks before they would even be considered for residential.
Interesting.
Well, and they live on the streets.
Yeah.
They aren't going to stay sober on the streets.
No.
Life is just way too hard.
So it would be hard for any of us.
Yeah.
And they have 8 other things that are playing against them.
Yeah.
And that's the struggle. One of the things I observed when my daughter was in the hospital, so 23 weeks, you're talking about this big, right? Born right at the edge of viability, had to beg, plead, borrow, steal, convince to even give her an opportunity. And it was fascinating because it was total system failure. And we'd get one body part working and something else would fail and it would cause a ripple effect, and we'd get something. So it was constantly playing this game of House of Cards.
Right.
And because I'm a psychologist, of course, I was watching behavior, and we started realizing that her behavior was as indicative as many of the medical results. And so I would participate in rounds, and we would really maneuver through, but it was such a needle to thread. And if it weren't for the fact that my skill set lies in designing of this kind of a system, she would not. I mean, this was just way too difficult. I then broadened that to this concept of homelessness, where one little thing, and it's this ripple effect of problems. Where I see possible support is in the same way that I saw it with her, which was, what are the foundational things I can get in place? And then how do I build up to the next? And then how do we build up to the next? And as we captured that energy, she was able to get better and better and better. And an interesting thing that I did when she was 5 months old, I told the doctor I was taking her home. We don't do that, ma'am. You don't just give it the side. I said, well, she can't get better here because there's so many things taking her energy inside. And so she's breathing too hard to gain weight. She's being poked too often to be able to settle down. She's not learning to nap or reduce her anxiety. You're going to create a child that barely stays alive but never can thrive. We are going to have home health, and we're going to take her home. And wow, when she got in that safe setting, and there was predictability, and there was less waking up in the middle of the night, her energy built and built and built. And within a few months, she was this plump child they just couldn't even believe. But it was knowing how to build that up.
We don't have a healthcare system. We have a sick care system.
Well, you might like my healthcare plan then, because the first pillar is we have to change our focus to wellness.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the same thing here. How do we
I think
design the system to build up?
If you think hospitals are all about health, look at what they serve in their cafeterias.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I took my daughter. I mean, they did a tremendous job. I can't say one negative thing. They were so wonderful. I also recognized that eventually.
They were dealing with the pathology.
That's right. And I became mom at one point and said, now it's time for me to help her live.
Baby needed a mom.
Yeah. And I think now this is where we look at our populations, those folks who are addicted to drugs, which some people say, well, they shouldn't have done that. Well, it's also sometimes self-medicating.
For the mentally ill, and when I was a kid, I played around with stuff. And fortunately...
I didn't. That's on record, right?
Okay. Well, fortunately for me, I had a significant religious conversion experience, and I don't have an addictive personality. And so I could walk away from it, and it's not a problem. Other people,
No, they can't.
they can't. They just can't do that. It's. I heard someone say they can't understand how a person could have just one drink. They just don't understand that.
Wow.
And that the saying is
I can have a half.
One's too many, 1,000's not enough.
Wow.
And it's just this. I don't get that.
Right, because you don't have that yearning.
It's like gambling. I can go into a casino with $20, drop $5 maybe on slots, and walk out.
Yep.
And not particularly enjoy it. I had a friend that worked in a casino when I was in college, and she said people there, they don't gamble to win. They win so they can keep on gambling.
Wow.
And,
That's a different perspective.
It's a different personality. And so, you never know the people that are just messing around with it as high school students, which ones are, it's a hook they can't get out of their system. So.
Yeah, so it sounds like we have to build up,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's, if you take care of the housing, you have the energy to stabilize. If you stabilize, then you have the energy to find new social support. You have new social support, you have the energy
Right.
to go find either a job or a placement.
Yeah.
In some cases it will involve disability, but there's a subset
Right.
disability. There's a lot of folks that could do something. And then once you have that energy, you have the ability to start moving up. And if we could create that movement.
Mm-hmm. There's a program in Seattle called Housing First.
Uh-huh.
And it's actually all over the country, but
Yes.
I saw the program in Seattle. And they give you a place to live.
Yeah.
You can drink. There's social workers there if you want to stop, but that's not a condition of staying there.
Okay.
So they have their own room, they have their own bed, they have a stove that cuts off after 15 minutes automatically. If you're cooking, you're going to have to turn it on every 15 minutes for obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
If someone wants to visit them, they've got to leave their license at the door before they can come up, and there's a doorkeeper and such. They found 45% of the people, without any interventions to try to persuade them to stop drinking, 45% cut their drinking in half. Just because they had a place to live. It's kind of when we look at the problems and we say, how are you sick? And we don't ask, what would make you well? And so that's what we treat as the sickness. Mentally ill, your brain is messed up, we'll give you drugs. And if you're living on the street, how do you take them every day? How do you get them? How do it's you've got so many other things you're worrying about, that taking a damn pill every day is the last thing on your list to do, when in fact it's the most important thing you need to do in the long run. But you put them in a house and you give them some stability, which is one of our first needs, housing. They don't have to worry about what they're going to eat. And, they don't have to worry about where they're going to sleep at night. And all of a sudden, they can understand the pill a little better. We need to treat health and getting people better instead of just what little part of you is sick. We'll treat that, because we're whole people. We've got it all. And I know, for me, when I'm feeling stressed, I've got to go do something that's normal.
Yes.
That's,
Yes.
I've got books that are like Lord of the Rings. Whenever I'm in a stressful period in my life, I just read Lord of the Rings, and it just kind of takes me back to, it's like a home for me. It calms me down. We all have these coping mechanisms, but for people who are on the margins, they don't have those coping mechanisms. And the ones they need the most, housing, food, things like that, adequate care for, when we, in our transitional house, we take them for a mental health assessment, and we take them to a doctor. And like one person needed glasses. She had needed glasses, we don't know how long. And it took us a while for us to realize she couldn't see. So we got her glasses. Life changed a lot for her after that.
Wow.
Wow,
you do great work. This is wonderful to
we
learn about.
we just fell into it all. It was just kind of like, this was the next step.
Well, I love it.
So-
Well, thank you so much for sharing it
Sure.
with us. We really appreciate it.